right, welcome everyone. Welcome everyone tonight for our special presentation here. As you can see on the sign above me, please silence all of your electronic devices so they don't go off during the talk. Our guest speaker this evening, Dr. Houts, became a Christian in 1999 along with his wife. Dr. Houts is currently a nuclear engineer working at NASA. He brought some books and things in the lobby, so if you want to look at those, feel free. Most of them are just one copy, so we're not going to sell off that one copy, but most are available through Apologetics Press, or there's Answers in Genesis, I think. So if you're interested in those, you can see Tom or I, and we'll help you make those arrangements along the way. After he is done this evening with his talk, there'll be some time for questions and answers. Suggested that you write down your questions so you don't forget them. And then once he's done, he'll ask you if you have any questions. Please line up behind the microphone there, and then you'll have a place to answer those questions as well. If you want to read everything about Dr. Houts, his entire bio is on our website. I'm not going to read that to you because otherwise he'd only have like 10 minutes to speak. So I think we want to hear more than that. So let's give our attention to Dr. Houts.
All right, well, good evening. I'd like to thank everyone for being here. I'd like to thank the elders here at Royal Oak for arranging this and, again, making all the arrangements. I should mention they also picked the title, which unfortunately these days is just really appropriate. And so it's Unmasking the Science. And what we're going to really talk about is, true science is the Christian's friend. And just really want to emphasize that. Because it's almost been, I'll say like inverted, where somehow it's people try to think, well, maybe there's this conflict between science and the Bible, and science might lead us into other religions or into atheism, and that's not true. And so that's one of the things we'll be talking about tonight, tomorrow night, Sunday, and again, just want to make sure, please don't leave with any remaining questions. Not saying that, if there's something that be really good to discuss, really want to make sure that we get that, we get to just a chance to discuss it sometime during the weekend. Also, feel free to send me an email anytime if you have anything you think of, like sometime next week or something. And then also a lot of really good material available at Apologetics Press, and so that's the website at the bottom there as well. And so I'm going to start out. A lot of this will be focused on atheism, although we'll mention some of the other evidences we have, just really for Christianity, why we should be putting our faith in the Bible. But want to just kind of hit the one topic head on, because again, a lot of our schools, a lot of our, you go on the internet, a lot of our museums, a lot of magazines, they have this, they tend to confuse science with atheism. And if you start, just maybe throughout the week, just kind of look for that. So when someone starts talking about something, or they say scientists think that, well, no, it's usually not scientists thinking something. Usually it's atheists with scientific credentials speaking as atheists. And there are some very highly credentialed atheists, and so that's one thing to remember. But as far as, again, true science really refutes atheism. And what I mean by that is to try to keep things in simple terms, terms we can think about, terms we can use if we're talking to our friends or neighbors or relatives. Really what atheism says is the universe and everything in it simply made itself. And that goes against literally everything we know about science. And we'll only have a chance to talk about a few topics tonight and tomorrow, but hopefully we'll get through quite a few. They said I'm supposed to wrap up by 8:30, and so I clarified that was 8:30 Central Time, and so we should be okay. But anyway, just a lot of material that we could be talking about. So again, true science is a Christian's friend, the enemy of the atheist, and God has given us tremendous evidence that we should put our faith in Him. He also lets us that be our choice, though, and so that's one of the things we'll be talking about in a couple of slides. Did want to start with some scripture, though. Romans 1:20, for since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Ephesians 4:14 through 15, as a result, we are no longer to be children, tossed here and there by waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by the trickery of men, by craftiness and deceitful scheming. But speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in all aspects into Him who is the head, even Christ. several really important bits of wisdom in those verses. First, whenever we're talking about something, we need to be speaking the truth in love, because sometimes, depending on what kind of mood we're in, what kind of day we've had, sometimes it's tempting just to try to win an argument, or just, and that's not at all what we're trying to do. I mean, if we are really loving our neighbors as ourselves, the most important thing we can do for them is to help them be able to spend eternity with God. And so what we're talking about for the next few days is really just to help someone to kind of objectively consider the Bible. I'm not sure how else to describe it, but a lot of people, for whatever reason, they're not really willing with an open mind to just objectively consider Christianity, objectively consider the Bible. And so a lot of what we'll be talking about is try to just find a way to encourage them to do that, find a way to help them do that. So that's speaking the truth in love. But we also have to be aware of, talking about trickery of men, craftiness, and deceitful scheming. There's a lot of that goes on also. And so we'll try to point some of those things out also, because many people, if they don't think about it, it's again very easy to be carried away by that. And we did talk about loving our neighbors as ourselves, and so I just read Mark 12:29-31. Jesus answered, "The foremost is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these." And so again, view any topic, any time we're studying with someone, speaking with someone, we're really both loving God and then loving our neighbors as ourselves. Now, mention that God has given us tremendous evidence, but God lets us choose. And so that's easy to say, but and just kind of gloss over or breeze past that. But if we stop and think about just the fact that God lets us choose, tells us how we should choose. In other words, you could almost say that it's proof for God. And the reason is if we were just all several thousand trillion atoms, and so that's, of course, if we didn't have a soul, if God had not given us a soul, that's all we would be. It's really the only option. Then if we were just purely chemical, and it does work out, we each be several thousand trillion atoms, then we could not make a choice. In other words, we would just be a chemical reaction. So to try to illustrate that, that's why I have the picture of the family by the campfire. It's a nice, relaxing picture. This time of year is great time to go out, have campfires, bonfires. But that's not the point of the picture. The point is that wood that's burning on the fire. And so if you look at that wood burning on the fire, wood burning is actually a very sophisticated chemical reaction. It depends on the temperature of the wood, the composition of the wood, the texture of the wood, depends on the air surrounding the wood, the temperature of that air, where the air, velocity of the air going past the wood. We all know if the fire is struggling a little bit, you just blow on it a little bit. You usually help along. So it's a really complicated chemical reaction. In fact, if we use our best laboratory equipment, in other words, we do everything we can to measure that piece of wood, looking at things like the texture, the composition, best laboratory equipment, and our best computer programs, best combustion programs, looking at computational fluid dynamics, best we can do, we can't predict how a piece of wood is going to burn when we throw it on a fire. Okay, so it's a very complicated chemical reaction. But the question is, can the wood decide where it's going to burn? In other words, it's a very complicated chemical reaction, but you ever have a piece of wood like, well, I think I'll burn over here. It's silly. People wouldn't even think that. Well, if all we were chemicals, we would be the same way. Literally, we could not make a single choice, because when push came to shove, we would just be a chemical reaction. Okay, is that sort of clear to anybody? Okay, good. I always get the person in back, so that's Okay, so. But that's a really important point, because sometimes people might say, we might be talking to them, and they'll say, you say, hey, would you like to come to church Sunday? And they might come back with, oh, well, I'm an atheist. And you can say, well, did you choose to be an atheist? And they'll almost always say, yeah, I chose to. Well, then you can, speaking the truth in love, just work them through. Just work through. Well, if you really chose, that proves atheism's wrong. In other words, if atheism was right, they didn't choose to be an atheist. That was just how their chemicals got lined up, how their atoms got lined up. And so it is a very, again, just a conversation starter. It's always tough starting conversations. It's because you have to start the conversation, get it on topic. You don't want to be too confrontational, but it's still important that we get it on topic. I'm from Alabama, college football. Wow, you want to think about tough conversations. So I mean, anyway, it's just something we need to practice with. And so another point, and I'll try to do this throughout the weekend, is you say, okay, well, they're going to go and find some way to refute this. Well, it turns out that the atheists agree with it, and it is airtight. I mean, if we were just chemicals, we cannot make a choice. And so there was this conference, it's been about 9 years ago now, and it was an interdisciplinary workshop on moving naturalism forward. And it was a lot of atheists, and they got together in Vermont. And so one of the quotes, this was originally from Francis Crick, says, "You, your joys, your sorrows, your memories, and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. Who you are is nothing but a pack of neurons." Okay? So Francis Crick, okay, again, this is, talk about atheists with scientific credentials. I mean, he co-discovered DNA. So you're not going to run across someone that says, "Oh, I got better credentials than Francis Crick." But the question is that statement scientific? Yeah, it's not scientific at all. It's 100% religion. His religion is atheism, and so he makes a very purely religious statement. But again, so that's just one example. We'll give several where look at the person. No one's going to argue that he was a phenomenal scientist. But when he makes a statement like that, is that a scientific statement or is it a religious statement? And that's just purely religious. He's just promoting atheism. And so that's his way of trying to promote his particular religion. Goes on, talks about, says this view is the naturalism that the workshoppers and the Berkshires were trying to move forward. Naturalism, also called materialism, the view that only matter exists, or reductionism, the view that all life, from tables to daydreams, is ultimately reducible to pure physics, or determinism, the view that every phenomena, including our own actions, is determined by a pre-existing cause, which was itself determined by another cause, and so on back to the Big Bang. Okay, so literally they're saying that the seat that your determinism would be the exact place you're sitting, what you wore, when you decided to leave your house, all that was determined back at the Big Bang. We'll talk about the Big Bang tomorrow night. That's also a false idea, but that would be the view of determinism. And then it goes on. They talk about, this is a really interesting quote because it goes on, he says, "If we repeatedly tell folks that their sense of free will or belief in objective morality is essentially an illusion, such knowledge has the potential to undermine civilization itself." Okay, so, but why? And this is where it gets really contradictory, to me at least, because if we're just a chemical reaction, it really doesn't matter what they tell us, right? I mean, we're just going to be our chemicals are just going to react, how they react. If, how can they supposedly know this, and that's okay, but us low people aren't allowed to know it. So you get a little bit of that mixed in, and then. But then at the end he says, if the public were told that for general purposes self and free will and objective morality do indeed exist, just not in the way they think. And so, okay, now that goes back to the craftiness and deceitful scheming. Because the other thing you will run into if you go out on an atheist website or you talk to some atheists and say, well, atheism, we couldn't have free will if we didn't have a soul. And they'll say, oh, no, you have deterministic free will. Okay, so if you're not paying attention, you're like, oh, okay, I just heard the phrase free will. And I don't know what he meant by deterministic, but deterministic free will. Okay, so the atheists say we have free will. Well, you look up what deterministic free will is, and it basically means that our chemicals, not only do they make us do all kinds of amazing things, they also even trick us into thinking we're making choices. Okay, so that's deterministic free will. So deterministic free will is not free will at all. But that's another term you might hear, and there'll be others. But so I guess point one, and spend a lot of time on this, but I think it's really important. Just the fact that we get to choose where we're putting our faith tells us where we should put our faith. And so that's why it's a very important point. The other thing, if we're talking to people, and in general, is staying focused on eternity. Matthew 16:26, "For what profit is it to a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul?" And many ways to look at this. Long life on earth now, I I don't know, I do it, I don't know if other people do. If you run across an obituary or you hear someone that died and they were over 100 years old, I can't help but think, wow, that was a really long life. Over 100 years, that's really long. I'm Methuselah, 969 years. Wow, that was a really long life. That's zero compared to eternity. And so if we're talking to someone and we're having trouble getting their attention, having trouble getting them to just really think about why what we're saying is important, I think that's a really good point to make. But the other point on eternity is, eternity is basically, it's, one way to think about it is an infinite number of years, but a more accurate way to think about it is it's actually completely outside of the dimension of time. So have you ever heard the question, if God made the universe, who made God? Okay, so if we go back to Genesis 1:1, it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So not only did God create the heavens and the earth, he also created time. Because in the beginning, that means God created time. And so God created time. So then the question is, could anything, so he created time, so he has to be outside of time, right? He couldn't create time if he's inside of time. So God has to be outside the dimension of time. And so the question would be, could anything outside the dimension of time have a beginning or an end? And of course it can't. The word beginning and end makes no sense outside the dimension of time. So by definition, God could not have a beginning or an end. Now why this? So that's that right there. It answers the question, and hopefully that gets people over that point of discussion. But that's what the other theories, you'll get, like the Big Bang, and people say, well, what caused the Big Bang? And the answer sometimes is, well, the Big Bang exploded from a point of infinite density where the laws of nature don't apply. Boy, that's technical, point of infinite density. But that little last part, where the laws of nature don't apply, what does that make it? Supernatural, right? Or there's a universe generator outside of our universe that has generated an infinite number of universes. So it's a universe generator outside of nature that's generated infinite. Well, again, it's an appeal to the supernatural. Many philosophies don't even address the origin of the universe. And so, people start saying, well, why should we believe the Bible versus other religions or philosophies? The Bible addresses this on the very first verse. You'll have many that are just based on I call them it's kind of like the New Age religions, I guess you'd say. Where Carl Sagan used to say the universe is all there is and all there ever was and all there ever will be. Well, where'd it come from? Or you have just it's almost like it's kind of like universe worship, but it never answers where the universe came from. Or you'll have some philosophies talk about reincarnation. Well, where did that all come from? What was the we'll be talking a lot about the scientific evidence in support of the Genesis account. But so it's actually it's a really important point. The Bible addresses in the very first verse that by definition God could not have been made. God could not have had a creator. Other with atheism, they'll try to, again, deceitfulness, craftiness, try to make it sound really, really technical, but it's an appeal to the supernatural. Oh, by the way, their universe generator can't give me free will. So I can kind of rule out the point of infinite density of the universe generator just because I know I just chose to do that with my remote. So it's, but it's a really, just even this point alone is a real, I'd say just a distinguishing point between Christianity and probably 90% of the religions and philosophies that are out there. There are some, some other religions that basically use Genesis. I would say though that, but it's, again, the Genesis account is is unique in that respect. Okay, so now we'll start moving into a little bit of what we'll call maybe the harder science. Okay, so again, we're talking about, science is the Christian's friend. True science is the Christian's friend, and we'll have some quotes coming up, but the more we learn about life, the more we know that even the so-called simple life is vastly more complicated than anything we can conceive of. And so at that point, we have two paths we could go down. We can, there's whole books. Not sure I brought one. There's books now just coming out. I think one is like the Pathway to Life or the Stairway to Life, something like that. But it just has all the things that would have to happen or has to happen for just to get the physical properties of life, the physical assembly of life. So again, the more we study life, the more incredibly complicated we know it is. The more we study DNA, we used to think of DNA as just like reading reading a book. It's just a sequence of letters, and it's almost like you're reading the book. Now we know DNA it's more like a incredibly sophisticated computer program. That's even like some of the computer programs they use for invoking artificial intelligence, and it's just the trend. We know it's going to end up even more sophisticated than we're currently imagining it to be. But that's hard to, if you just, again, the goal is get someone to objectively consider the Bible, study the Bible with us. Plant the seed, water, help people to be able to spend eternity with God. You're not, getting into a multi-day study on just, the origin of life. They might not be interested enough. If they are, that's great, because again, true science is the Christian's friend. But so maybe one way to just get them thinking would be just a simple question. And so one way to phrase that question could be, well, is it scientific to believe that something happens spontaneously? Of course, we're talking about life arising from non-life that we've been unable to duplicate given our best laboratories, our smartest scientists, and virtually unlimited financial resources. And so, you think about it, we can make computers, we can make airplanes, we can make space shuttles, all the things we can make. God's given us the creativity and the intelligence to make, at least from our perspective, some pretty amazing things. We can't make life. We can't come anywhere close to making simple life. And so, to somehow, but sometimes you'll read in a textbook or go into a museum or a zoo or something, and it'll pretend, here's the scientific explanation. 3.8 billion years ago, life made itself. Now, again, insert about 200 more words because it has to sound like it's technical, sound like scientific. But that's essentially what they're saying. The 3.8 billion years, to me, that's always just kind of to fuzz the problem, because you had the same chemicals, same basic atmosphere, same basic pressures, temperatures. But 3.8 billion years ago, it's you probably start to notice. I do like space movies, and so when Star Wars starts out, anybody ever watch a Star Wars movie? Okay, so you remember right at the start. In the late 70s, man, that was really high tech, computer animation with the letters, going back up the screen. So, it says, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. And what was neat about that in hindsight was by having it happen a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, that meant I didn't have to think about it. I was just going to sit back and enjoy it, because anything could happen a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Just let your imagination run. And so that was, one point maybe it was trying to make. But that's kind of the same thing when they talk about life making itself. We know life can't make itself, but maybe a long time ago. Now, it doesn't say galaxy far, far away, but at least they do the long time ago. But it doesn't work. And so a lot of different ways we can look at that. We'll go through a few examples, but, if life could make itself, and we had any way at all, any of even hypothesis. That's something, when we send our kids off to first grade, rather than coming back with a little handprint on a piece of paper that we all keep on the refrigerator for 20 years, they should come back with some life. Like, hey, look, Joey made, this is the life Joey made in first grade, because that's how simple it would be if it just happened randomly. And so again, of course, life is just more complicated than anything we've ever made. If someone says life made itself, and the way to look at it is, well, could a space shuttle make itself? Could an airplane make itself? Could a computer make itself? Of course not. You will. The one response you will get is, well, I think, or the person will say they think that in 100 years we'll figure out how to make life. And I disagree, but you can just point out, well, okay, if in 100 years we figure out how to make life, does that prove it just made itself? Again, that's just like saying, between 1903 and, 1964 was it? We went from, we figured out how to make SR-71, but does that prove SR-71s make themselves? So it's kind of it's an irrelevant argument, just because we can, again, just because God gave us the creativity and the intelligence to learn how to be able to do some amazing things, doesn't mean it's going to happen randomly. So just a few thoughts. This is back in 1876. And so when we say true science is the Christian's friend, every time in every area that science advances, it confirms the Bible. The Bible doesn't need confirmed, so we can say it becomes more consistent with the Bible, or but just as true science advances, it is always the Christian's friend. This is a quote. This was a book Ernst Haeckel wrote, A History of Creation, back in 1876. And I'll just read a couple quotes. It says, during late years, we've become acquainted with Monera, organisms which are in fact not composed of any organs at all, but consist entirely of shapeless, simple, homogeneous matter. The entire body of one of these Monera during life is nothing more than a shapeless, mobile little lump of mucus or slime consisting of an albuminous combination of carbon. Simpler or more imperfect organisms we cannot possibly conceive. Okay, so you see what he's getting at? Smart guy, really smart. So he knows, but again, craftiness, deceitful scheming, he knows that life has to be really simple. If we're going to claim life just made itself, it's got to be just incredibly simple. And so that last sentence, simpler, more imperfect organisms we cannot possibly conceive. And then there's some question, he may have actually thought he was finding these Monera. He talks about that little photographic plate in the upper left-hand corner. That was something that he described as a Monera. And he talks about all kinds of Monera that he'd found in various places around the world. He talks, Canary Islands and, off the Norwegian coast. Goes on, he talks about other people that have found Monera. He talks about, Huxley, finding, Monera in like 24,000, feet of water. So again, this is, it's, coming up on probably 145 years ago. Well, of course it was completely wrong. And so the evidence that the Monera was interesting is people looking even by 1875, so this was a year before the book was published, they knew that Monera were nothing more than amorphous gypsum precipitated out of seawater by alcohol. So it's nothing to do with life, but it was still taught for like 50 years that, they found these really simple life, in various places in the ocean. So that's, now you'd never get away with that. If someone said, I found this little lump of slime that's living, and because you'd have to prove it, and we'd have the science to prove it, and we could examine it. We didn't have the science then. So again, when I say ignorance, what it means is we just didn't know, so we couldn't refute it. Now there's no way someone could get away with that. And again, I'll say proof's in the pudding. You can't. The more we learn about life, the more complicated that we know it is. Now, we talked about DNA, extremely complex molecule, used to code for all the physical characteristics of all life. And of course, DNA is composed of nucleotides. We'll talk a little bit more about DNA and just the whole idea of information in the genome here in a few slides. But again, it's a very complicated molecule. And so the question is, those building blocks, do they randomly assemble themselves? And so sometimes you'll hear someone, again, I'll go back to the Star Wars, where someone will say, well, yeah, it's really complicated, but boy, given billions of years, maybe anything can happen. And so again, it's that mystique. Well, maybe, it looks impossible, maybe given billions of years. And so a very analogous discussion occurred. This is all the way back in 1860. And this was Thomas Huxley. He proposed that given 6 monkeys, 6 typewriters, unlimited time, the monkeys would eventually type all the books in the British Library. Okay, and so but let's go ahead and apply that to now I think most evolutionists will say I think right now there's a lot of debate, but some will say the universe is maybe 13.8 billion years old, somewhere in there. That's about the oldest age you'll hear. Maybe go up to 20 billion years. So the question is, if we gave them that whole 20 billion years, what would those monkeys actually type? Okay, and so if we look at that. So again, he said monkeys and typewriters, so we'll make it as favorable to the evolutionists as possible. And we'll say, okay, let's make the typewriters, we won't worry about punctuation, we won't worry about uppercase, lowercase, we'll just have 26 letters. Okay, so there's 26 letters of the alphabet. And the idea, of course, of the monkeys is they're just going to hit keys randomly. So what would be the odds of the monkeys just randomly hitting a W? Okay, you're 1 in 26, right? You had 26 options, randomly hits the letter. So it's 1 in 26 hitting a W. Hitting a W followed by an E, well, you got 1 in 26 for the W, followed by 1 in 26 for the E. So now you're at 1 in 676. So now you got 1 in 26, 1 in 26, 1 in 26, 1 in 26, 1 in 26. Well, that ends up being 1 in 11,881,376. Okay, that's getting kind of unlikely. We are a bunch of monkeys. Okay, so we are a bunch of monkeys. Now you have to switch to scientific notation. And so that's basically saying it's 1 in, just think of a 2 followed by 28 zeros. And this starts to, when you see numbers like that, those are numbers that, they're really hard to comprehend what that means. We talk about, that was 1 in a million. Well, that's 1 in 1 followed by 6 zeros. 1 in a billion, well, that's 1 and 1 followed by 9 zeros. 1 in a trillion, well, that's 1 and 1 followed by 12 zeros. So right now, just we are a bunch of monkeys, 1 and 1 followed by 28 zeros. So that's pretty unlikely. Now, we are a bunch of monkeys trying to type something that makes sense. It's not working yet, but maybe given infinite time. Now you're looking at 1 in a 7 followed by 135 zeros. I mean, so 135 zeros after that. Now, and so just to give an idea, every now and then, someone will, if they're trying to be poetic, they'll say things like, well, no one really knows how long 20 billion years is. And just tell them, well, it's 6.3 times 10 to the 23rd microseconds. Okay, and then the point of saying that is, that's a millionth of a second. The number of atoms in the universe is 1 followed by 80 zeros. It's less than 1 followed by 80 zeros. So when you start looking at these numbers, well, that's small compared to that simple string of letters that we talked about. In other words, that 23rd in the exponent or that 80th in the exponent, it's exponential. It's really small compared to having the 135 in the exponent. Just for typing a string of letters that maybe makes a little sense. And so time doesn't help. You're not going to randomly assemble anything, even a protein or DNA, just using time. It doesn't help. And that's just writing it out. That's the 1 in 6.89 is a 1 chance in, and then that number down there. We know if they get into a little more detail, there was the idea, I think it was back in the 50s, had things like the Miller-Urey experiment, trying to make amino acids. That was really popular. When I was in college, it was in all the biology textbooks, and I was still an evolutionist then, so I still believed in evolution. Miller-Urey experiment was really touted as this experiment showing that amino acids could randomly form themselves. But then people started pointing out all of the stuff that they left out because it was just pretty simple chemistry. They concocted just the right mixture of water and gases and a spark, and so you could predict what was going to happen. But they left out all kinds of information. And so my daughter's biology textbook had 2 of the 4 editors were the same. And it switched from, the Miller-Urey experiment. Wow, that shows life can just make itself too. Well, Miller-Urey experiment, that wasn't, didn't really show too much. And but that was, again, advances in science, over a period of, probably 25, 30 years between when those 2 textbooks were published. But just a few things. It doesn't mention, simple protein is, say, 70 amino acids strung together. That's about the simplest protein you'll get. Right there, the odds of those being strung together in a water environment is 1 and 1 followed by 140 zeros. So that right there shows it's impossible. But then the building blocks, in this case, trying to make a protein, they have to be all left-handed, basically. Spontaneously formed building blocks are an even mix, and so that doesn't, if you had an even mix of those building blocks, and again, it gets into a fair amount of detail. It's stuff you can go through in an hour or two if someone gets really interested. But again, the left-handedness and the right-handedness affects the physical structure of the protein, which, again, proteins even are so sophisticated that physical structure is important. It's not just the right string of amino acids put together. The Miller-Urey experiment, very small amount of amino acids, about 2% of the products. Had to remove the products to avoid destruction. Also produced 85% tar, 13% carboxylic acid, both toxic to living systems. Ongoing controversy whether the proposed atmosphere ever existed. One of the things that's interesting, if you go back into the early 90s, NASA sent a probe into the Jovian atmosphere. It's the Galileo probe. And it was pretty well publicized. I think now it would have been all over the internet. Then the internet wasn't quite as big. But this idea that, the Jovian atmosphere is perfect, for what the, Miller-Urey, or what people that propose things like the Miller-Urey experiment, primordial, whatever, it was just like perfect atmosphere for life to form. And there were even people saying that we'd see some really complicated molecules, or we might even see life flying around in Jupiter. We get there, and I think some of the most complicated molecule we found is things like C2H6. Okay, so nothing close to anything that technically C2H6 because it has carbon and more than one atom. It's a complex organic molecule. So some people try to start out portraying it as that, but that's basically, it's simpler than the propane in your tank out back. So I mean, it's so it's again, it's so anyway, the predictability. this idea, predicted we'd see stuff on Jupiter. We saw nothing, and we did send a probe through the atmosphere. And then there's every now and then someone will write a computer program seeking predetermined result, saying if I wanted to, if I wrote a computer program like that, we are a bunch of monkeys, and it just randomly generated letters until it found a W, then it locked in the W, randomly generated, letters that have found E, locked in the E. Those are completely irrelevant to what we're talking about now, but you'll see programs like that also. And so then you start looking at, okay, what do some of the more famous scientists say about this? Well, this is a quote from Frederick Hoyle. So he coined the term Big Bang, a famous British astronomer. He said, the likelihood of the formation of life from inanimate matter is 1 to a number with 40,000 noughts after it. It is enough to bury Darwin and the whole theory of evolution. There is no primeval soup, neither on this planet nor on any other, and if the beginnings of life were not random, they must therefore have been the product of purposeful intelligence. Okay, so if you're out door knocking and you're just getting a conversation and you ask somebody, well, where do you think life came from? And they responded this way, what would you think? I mean, you'd be like, wow, this is great. We'll do a Bible study. Well, first you think, wow, this guy's really smart, and then you'd be like, okay, we'll do a Bible study. This is going to go really well. Well, it turns out, Frederick Hoyle, from science, he knew life couldn't make itself, and from science, we know life can't just make itself, okay? But for whatever reason, he didn't want to believe in God, and so this goes back to keeping the goal in mind. Our goal is to encourage someone to objectively consider the Bible, encourage them to obey the gospel, so that they can spend eternity with God. And so, so you say, well, what would he do? Well, you'll notice some of the books he wrote. One of them was Evolution from Space, and he wrote a few others. But he came up with this idea called it directed panspermia, and he wrote 3 books on it. And basically, directed panspermia sounds very technical, sounds very scientific. It was basically saying that evolution doesn't work. I don't want to believe in God. He didn't want to believe in God. So therefore, aliens must have put us here. Okay, and that's still, I think that's regaining popularity, this whole idea that maybe aliens put us here on Earth, or there's all this mystique around aliens or interest in aliens. But the obvious question, right? It's like, okay, so aliens put us here. Well, okay, where'd the aliens come from? Who made the aliens? And he doesn't want to, again, he does not want to believe in God. So his only option is to say, well, there were smarter aliens that made the aliens that put us here, and then, well, the really smart aliens made the smarter aliens that made it, and so it just completely falls apart. Now, the point I want to make is, he's a smart person, and so, and I don't think anyone ever, to my knowledge, no one ever understood why he wouldn't consider putting his faith in God. But there's probably a reason, and so a lot of times we'll be studying or talking to people that are really smart, and a lot of times it takes a while. We really have to get to know a person to figure out, okay, what is keeping them from being open-minded? Because they know they have free will. They know that the universe came from somewhere, and it's always an appeal to the supernatural. It might be a technical-sounding version of the supernatural, but it's always an appeal to the supernatural. They know things like life can't just make itself, but for whatever reason, they just and so I don't. It depends on a person. I've been blessed to go on 3 really good mission trips over the summer. I got to go to Zimbabwe and South Africa in May and June, and then Honduras in July, and then I just got back from Peru about 3 weeks ago. And one of the things that's interesting, and I'm not sure, I need to see if it's, get out in the U.S. more, but people are actually seem like they're more interested in talking now. And what I mean by more interested is you'll have in a door knocking where you might have expected to talk to someone for 5 minutes, they'll want to talk for like 2 hours. And so the only thing I'll mention is in Honduras, it was twice, we were probably an hour and 15 minutes, hour and 30 minutes into really good conversation, real friendly, all through an interpreter, when the person really opened up. And so that's a lot. I don't know why, it just struck me. It wasn't like the standard, oh, well, they'll let you know in a couple minutes or not if they're interested or not. No, it was probably hour and 15 minutes, hour and a half in, and then once they opened up, you study the Bible, you go through the examples of a person being saved, and they were both baptized that same day. So it's just, that's just an anecdote. It might have been really unique, but it's really finding out what the person's stumbling block is. Why are they really resistant? Is just a thought from this. Because again, Fred Hoyle from that quote, he knew there was God, and so the question is just what. And maybe again, all I can say is I never heard of him becoming a Christian. That doesn't mean he didn't. I never, I hadn't heard anybody report that. So now, going to go talk a little bit about the genome. And of course, we talked about how DNA is an extremely complicated molecule that God uses to code for all the physical characteristics of basically all life on Earth. So it always has DNA. And so again, a lot of things we've been talking about, the most recent one is we know life can't just make itself. But suppose, just suppose you're starting with a bacteria. And we don't have to say where it came from, or some kind of quote-unquote simple life. Well, that quote-unquote simple life has a tremendous amount of genetic information in it, in its DNA. But say it was a bacteria. Well, to turn that bacteria, say, into an earthworm, well, it takes a huge addition of genetic information, because even though the bacteria is complicated, the earthworm's much, much more complicated. So now, then say that earthworm decides to turn into a mouse. Well, now, that's another huge addition of genetic information. And then that mouse, maybe tries to turn into a pig, and eventually end up with a human. And so the question is, well, where does all this genetic information come from? And from Genesis, we know that, in the beginning, God had all of the created kinds. And that's, and it talks about, animals, reproducing after their kind. So if we put I guess you'd say the modern science or the current science terminology onto that, you would say, God created the original kinds, and within those kinds, that's where you had the genetic information. So in other words, like the dog, I'll say there was a dog kind. I mean, it's just an example, but say there was a dog kind. Well, when God created the dog kind, all of the genetic information for all of the different breeds of dogs that we see today would have been in that original created kind. And so as true science has advanced, that's actually the conclusion we've come to. Atheists and Christians agree that basically all the breeds of dogs we see on Earth today could have come from a single pair of dogs. And that's just how incredible DNA is. That's how sophisticated DNA is as an information storage system. And so what you have is, you think about one analogy might be, it'd be like, starting with an encyclopedia and write a sentence about frogs. That's pretty easy. Encyclopedias, you look up frog, you write a couple sentences, kind of a good elementary school type exercise. So that, because you got all that information there. But the alternative would be have a sentence about frogs and then go off and write the entire encyclopedia. Well, that's a lot harder. And so again, the Bible, all the genetic information is there at the beginning. Now, since Adam sinned, we have mutations and natural selection, and that's acting on that original created genetic information. But that explains the physical characteristics of life that we see around us today. But the alternative is somehow maybe you started out with a bacteria, and then that bacteria somehow had to turn itself into all the other life we see around us. We've never seen that. We have never seen mutations and natural selection add new genetic information. And in fact, if we look at the textbook examples for evolution, they either have nothing to do with evolution, or they often show the opposite of evolution. And so we'll go into some of those. And so that's why want to mention another one. And again, it's to me it's a very deceptive term. And it's this whole idea of microevolution. So again, talk about the deceitfulness and craftiness of men. So microevolution, and you go in, again, these are like high school textbooks, and you go in and you look at the teacher's edition, and in the notes, I'm not saying, teachers are fantastic. I have no idea how they keep up with, I know teachers, they could keep up with like 130 kids, and there's no way they sleep. I mean, I don't know what else to say, So I'm not saying, but if you look in the textbooks that they're told that they have to use, whether they believe what's being said or not, they'll say things like, well, have your children go down to the pet store and look for a new breed of dog or cat and just say, well, that's change, and evolution's just change. So the fact that you just saw a new breed of dog or cat, that proves evolution. Well, it's completely deceptive because that change, as we talked about, that's the way you say develop a new breed of dog or cat is to get rid of genetic information that you don't want in that new breed. You never add genetic information. So there's other things where they call it microevolution, but the reason I think it's a deceptive term is the implication is if you have, linguistically, if someone says, well, I had lots of micro. Well, if you have lots of micro, you start thinking, well, okay, that could lead to macro, okay? So microevolution is, it's a new breed of dog or cat. Macroevolution is the bacteria turned itself into an earthworm, turned itself into a mouse, turned itself, and it's exactly the opposite, okay? Because one, the microevolution, you're at best information neutral, you're usually losing genetic information. Macroevolution, you have to gain genetic information. And so I try to use different analogies. I'll use start out with a financial analogy, and then maybe we'll do like a car analogy later on. Financial analogy would be, suppose, it's Friday night, and you're kind of bored this week, so you decide you're going to come to this investment seminar. Okay, so say this is an investment seminar. Well, if this was an investment seminar, then of course my job as a speaker is to get you to give me all your money, right? And so you give me all your money, and the way I do that is I say, well, if you give me all your money, we're going to be rich. I'll make us all rich. And so of course, people usually need a little more insight. And so, you'd be like, well, how are you going to make us rich? And I say, well, what we're going to do is we're going to make machines, and every time we sell a machine, we're going to lose $1. But don't worry, we're going to make it up in volume. Okay, you going to give me all your money? So unless you had a really bad week, you're probably not going to give me all your money, right? But that's the whole point. So this microevolution where you're typically losing genetic information, over long periods of time, that's not going to give you macroevolution where you have to gain genetic information. Basically, the species are going to go extinct. Okay, so everybody kind of, this one isn't the elevator speech unless it's a really tall building, but we'll go through it. We'll go through just a few examples of this. This is one example. This was in pretty much every textbook till about 2003, and now it's been replaced by Darwin's finches, but it's the same exact thing. In other words, what you have is natural selection affecting a population density, but you have no new genetic information created. So this one's going to talk about peppered moths. You'll still see peppered moths in some textbooks. You'll also see other examples, but they're always that same basic idea that's happening is, I'll say it again, it'll make more sense after we look at it a little bit. It's natural selection, acting on a population that affects the population density, but there's no new genetic information created. Okay, so in this case, this is peppered moths, and the idea was that before the Industrial Revolution, these were trees around London, England, and the idea was that the tree, they had kind of like a birch bark. I think you guys have birch trees up here. And so the bark was kind of like a birch bark color, and there was this type of moth that lived in the countryside, peppered moths, and they had two forms. They had the typica form on the left and the carbonaria form on the right. And so the most, or nearly all, probably 95, 98% of the moths were that typica form. And it made sense because the birch bark, if you think of a birch tree out in the country, well, it's that coloration on that typica form, it looks pretty similar. It's going to blend in against the bark. And so the idea was, well, a bird would be flying along, and that type of moth would be camouflage. It wouldn't tend to eat that moth. Now, the carbonaria form was rarer. In this case, it was less than 5%, but it was just really dark. Okay, but again, you can imagine a bird flying along, and you see that carbonaria form sitting on a tree with a kind of a white with a little bit of black spots in it bark. Well, it's going to stand out, and so it made total makes sense. Then the Industrial Revolution happens, and apparently the pollution around London got so bad that the tree bark actually turned dark. I guess it was just ash and soot on the tree bark. So the bark is now a very dark color, and the population density flipped. So you have now all of a sudden, the typica form on the left, well, it's going to stand out, right? I mean, you got this really dark bark, that light-colored moth, it's going to really stand out. So the birds are going to tend to eat it. That carbonaria form, it blends in really well now. Well, sure enough, population density flips. Now you're at maybe 2 to 5% typica form, 95-ish% carbonaria form. 1950s, clean up the air, the population density, again flips back because of the different camouflage. And this was touted in various biology textbooks as evolution in action. Okay, but based on our discussion, you see how that has nothing to do with evolution? Because the genetic information for the typica form and the carbonaria form was always there. And so if you look at Darwin's finches, they talk about different beak shapes and how the beak shapes and sizes depends on the seeds and the, whether there's drought or a wet period. And so again, it's all that genetic information is always there. And what's even sadder is it looks like Darwin's finches might be extinct within 100 years for other reasons. And it's not, it just, again, it's what you see with Darwin's finches is again just, it's just variation within a kind or just natural selection acting on existing information. Okay, so look at some other examples. I'll give one more with bacteria. We talk about bacteria developing resistance to antibiotics. And that's really important topic because bacteria are developing resistance to antibiotics. But to actually combat that, we need to, understand why they're developing the resistance and not, again, let it be true science. Don't basically don't let atheism or this idea or this need to try to prop up the theory of evolution creep in. And so the reason I say that is I think true science has one in this case. There's 3 ways bacteria develop antibiotic resistance. First one is say the ability to, or the information to resist the antibiotic is already in the bacterial population. So that'd be a case of, say I get an infection and I take an antibiotic and that antibiotic kills 999 out of 1,000 bacteria. Okay, that's a really good antibiotic. But if my immune system doesn't kill the remaining 1 out of 1,000 bacteria and it recolonizes my body, I'm now infected with an antibiotic resistant strain of bacteria. Okay? But it has nothing to do with evolution. It's the same as the peppered moths. It just changed the population density. In other words, the information to resist the antibiotic was always there, but by me taking the antibiotic, it changed the population density, but it didn't create any new genetic information. Another one is called a plasmid transfer, where you can, in a nutshell, you essentially can have a harmless bacteria that's resistant to an antibiotic. If it's in very close proximity to a harmful bacteria, it can actually transfer that resistance. It's like a small loop of DNA. And so that's one of the reasons they really carefully control, say, waste streams coming out of hospitals, because this is a hazard. Because again, now you can have harmful bacteria that are developing resistance to antibiotics. But again, nothing to do with evolution, because the information to resist the antibiotic was always in the population. So those are 2, I guess you'd call them information neutral, like the peppered moths, kind of information neutral. Third one is actually a loss of genetic information. And so some of our antibiotics, they operate by the bacteria essentially thinks the antibiotic is a nutrient. It takes the antibiotic into the bacteria and the antibiotic kills it. Okay, but what if the bacteria has an information-losing mutation? Okay, opposite of evolution. Information-losing mutation that makes it so it cannot intake that nutrient anymore. In other words, it lost the genetic information it needed to be able to intake that nutrient, which again, we had been using to basically, I won't say trick, because you can't really trick a bacteria, but basically we've been using that chemistry for it to ingest the antibiotic. Well, if it loses the ability to do that, information losing, now it's resistant to the antibiotic. So you've developed resistance to the antibiotic through the opposite of evolution. Okay, so that's and you get that with say control genes. Sometimes a bacteria can lose a control gene and produce a tremendous amount of an enzyme. So it's a loss. It'd be like yanking the thermostat out of this building. You lose the control gene. I imagine you unfortunately probably have some days coming up in a couple 3 months where you'll be just plenty happy with the heat going full blast. But imagine 3 or 4 months ago, you probably were happy with the days the heat wasn't going full blast. So it's so that's a loss of a control gene. But in some situations, that bacteria can become resistant to an antibiotic, because it's just, in that case, to be making just incredible amounts of an enzyme that it normally doesn't need but just because it lost the ability to control that production. So again, very important topic, but it's either neutral or in a lot of cases it actually shows the opposite of evolution. So I'll give the car analogy, and then we'll keep moving on. This is another way to think about mutations and natural selection. Okay, so what I want everybody to do is just imagine the perfect automobile. Okay, so everybody's going to have a different car. Whatever you think the perfect automobile is, get that in your mind, and then write a manual for manufacturing that perfect car. Okay, so you got your perfect, but then, just to make things more complicated, before you make any of the cars, go ahead and make 1,000 copies of that manual. Okay, so you've got the perfect manual for making a car. You made 1,000 copies, but then randomly change 100 words in each manual. Okay, so don't change the same 100 words in each manual. Just each manual, just take it, just randomly change 100 words. Okay, so now I've got 1,000 manuals, and I changed 100 words in each, but each one's different, each one's random. Well, that's about how many mutations accumulate each generation. Is between 100 and 1,000. Okay, so that's your mutations. Now go ahead and make 1,500 automobiles. Okay, so you had 1,000 manuals, but make 1,500 automobiles from those manuals. Are they all going to be perfect? No, right? I mean, they're not perfect because you had the perfect manual, but you changed 100 words in each manual. Okay, so what are the differences going to be? Well, some of them they're going to have different changes. So what if you had one and the rearview mirror is just kind of big? Okay, well, depending on what else you had, you might say, well, I can live with that. My neck might get a little sore, but I can just drive around the rearview mirror. Okay, that's fine. But then if you have one where the transmission's up on the roof, you're like, I can't live with that. It's not going to run. So get rid of the 500 cars that you just don't like. You just can't. They're the worst ones. Keep the 1,000 that you like the most. Okay, so that's natural selection. Okay, so now you've got the 1,000 cars that you liked. Well, let's do it again. Okay, so take the manuals that were used to make the 1,000 cars that you kept and change 100 more words in each of those manuals. Okay, so you change another 100 words. Same process, you make 1,500 cars. Some of them, again, if doesn't have any wheels on it, okay, I can't live with those. But if the wheels are purple, okay, so you start making your natural selection again. Do it again. After you've done that 100 times, every manual would have had 10,000 words changed in it. They'd all been different words, but each manual would have 10,000 words changed in it. And again, you'd be doing your natural selection each time. So the question is, how long is it going to take your car to turn into a jet airplane? Okay, that's probably not where you were going with that. And that's not the direction it's going to go. Unfortunately, what will happen is eventually you'll have error catastrophe where there'll no longer be a car. Basically, there's no longer going to be a manual that can make a working automobile. And again, unfortunately, that's what we're seeing. And so this is where I think another place where it becomes really obviously important that as Christians we have to get society focused on spiritual, focused on eternity, focused on God, and not focused on the spiritual. Again, Luke 10:27, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. Because what's happening is people are starting to realize that the genome is degrading. And we've seen that in science, we've seen that in the lab. We just saw it with the car analogy. It makes sense. Okay, so the genome's degrading. Now, the reason this is important is, when I grew up, I used to watch kids' cartoons, and every now and then they talk about, people a million years from now. And, we're always, it's kind of, the one I remember the most, they had the body was about this big, and then had this ginormous head, so we were just, apparently in a million years, we were just going to be all brain. But that's not what we're seeing. We're seeing the opposite. We're seeing this degradation. This was a paper by Lynch in 2016. He says, basically, Lynch estimates human fitness is declining 1% to 5% per generation. Okay, now you'd have to look at, how exactly did he define fitness? And that's hard to, but it shows just the thinking, it's kind of catching up with reality, that we're losing fitness. We're not becoming better. We're not, turning into a super race. Well, it's exactly what we would expect. So if we're focused on the spiritual, that's, you take everything into account, of course, but if we're focused on the spiritual, that doesn't really affect our focus on the spiritual. But if our society focuses on the physical, it can lead to some pretty, I guess I just say horrific ideas. This was a quote, this was from about 3 years ago, I guess 4 years ago now. And what had happened was Iceland and Denmark had come out and they had announced that they'd essentially eliminated Down syndrome. And of course, headlines made it sound really positive. You know, Iceland, I think it was Iceland, you know, said they'd announced that they'd eliminated Down syndrome. And you're like, well, how'd they do that? That's amazing. Just advanced technology. Well, it turned out they hadn't. It was actually horrible what they had done. They would do blood tests on expectant mothers, and if they thought the baby might have Down syndrome, they would put tremendous pressure on the mother to kill the baby. And so they apparently had succeeded, at least that was their claim, in essentially eliminating Down syndrome. So it stirred up a lot of discussion, obviously, and I guess what really bothered me was that people even attempted to push this as a positive thing to start with. A lot of things bothered me, of course, but this was a letter to the editor of the Denver Post, and it was a father that, I'll read it to you. It says, as the proud father of a wonderful 14-year-old son with Down syndrome, I was horrified at the news of a near eradication of children with Down syndrome in Iceland due to early identification procedures and early termination of pregnancies. Okay, so then he goes on and says, it is clear that technology is ahead of understanding of the contribution that children with Down syndrome make to their families and their communities. Studies show an extremely high happiness rate for families who have children with Down syndrome and also for persons with Down syndrome. And so really, really, really respect the father, but think of the position he felt like he was in. I mean, he's having to justify his son's existence by pointing out that his son's extremely happy, his son makes him extremely. So it's a really dangerous, path to go down where we're having to justify, someone's, basically right to exist. In this case, it was just based on happiness. So this was a letter to the editor. Now this was, and maybe this weekend we'll have time to show a video, or you can pull it up on YouTube. It's Frank Stevens, and he was testifying to a committee. Well, Frank Stevens has Down syndrome. And so it's an extremely powerful testimony. I'll read some of the quotes from that testimony, but I will say it's more powerful if you hear Frank Stevens saying it in his own words. So he starts out, just has, it's a little humorous, says he's not a research scientist, but he goes on and says, I'm a man with Down syndrome, my life is worth living. Again, trying to justify his life. Sadly, across the world, notions are being sold that maybe we don't need research concerning Down syndrome. Some people say prenatal screens will identify Down syndrome in the womb, and those pregnancies will just be terminated. Okay, so I'm trying to picture myself being him, and so say they had something in my DNA, and for whatever reason, people decided, well, people with Mike's DNA, we don't want that, and I'm having to stand up here and testify in front of a committee and talking about how, well, some people are saying that if they figure out someone has, my type of DNA, that they should just be terminated. I mean, I don't even know how he got through a lot of this testimony. It does say it's hard for me to sit here and say those words. I completely understand the people pushing this particular final solution are saying that people like me should not exist. That view is deeply prejudiced by an outdated idea of life with Down syndrome. Talks about, some of the things, that he's, knows from his life and things he's gotten to do. And then he goes through the, again, he has to make the same happiness argument. He talks about other benefits of research related to Down syndrome. But when he says finally, we are the canary in the eugenics coal mine. And you have to think about that for a little while. But so eugenics, that's what was being used before World War II. Of course, that was promoted by a lot of people, Hitler being the most famous. But this whole idea of eugenics, where you try to eliminate people that are less desirable, or whatever whatever the people that promote eugenics want to call them. They usually aren't that blunt. Some people might say develop a master race. The way things could be playing out, they have all kinds of excuses for it. But I think what he's saying by the canary in the eugenics coal mine is basically saying, okay, you start out with Down syndrome. Well, okay, maybe what if there's 10 other genetic differences that people decide they don't want, or 100 others, or 1,000 others, and so where does it stop? And so he's making some very important points. Now, this isn't new. Okay, this has been around for over 100 years, but what's new is we now have much more advanced technology. And technology can always be used for either good or evil. as a generality, the more advanced the technology, the more good it can be used for, or the more evil it can be used for. But the only difference really between now and 107 years ago, when this quote was written, is just the just basically the difference in the level of technologies. This was out of Hunters of Civic Biology. It was the most widely used biology textbook in the U.S. at that time. You can get a copy, or I just ordered a copy from somewhere, and it was actually used in the Detroit public schools. So you'll see some of these quotes, realizing that 107 or 100-ish years ago, because usually they use textbooks for a number of years, you had children, probably 15 miles from here, that were being taught that this was science. Okay, and so just kind of let that sink in. So this is the first quote. It says, if such people were lower animals, we'd probably kill them off to prevent them from spreading. Okay, so that's kind of a eugenics quote. It says humanity will not allow this, but we do have the remedy separating the sexes, asylums, et cetera, et cetera. So 107 years ago, humanity wouldn't allow it. Well, unfortunately now, apparently, if we cover it up with abortion and don't just point out that we're killing an unborn baby, apparently that's enough to somehow get it through. Or Psalm 127, 3-5, behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb is a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. Happy is the man who has his quiver full of them, they shall not be ashamed, but shall speak with their enemies in the gates. The Bible is very clear, children are a blessing. And it doesn't, no caveats, just children are a blessing from the Lord. Now, talk about another famous person. This is Margaret Sanger. She founded Planned Parenthood, and they actually, I'll just say, to me, it's a positive thing. Over the last 5 years or so, there's actually been some attention paid to the roots of Planned Parenthood. Even there was I think even an individual that either ran for president or was thinking about running for president for a little while, even really pointed this out. But this is a quote from Margaret Sanger, founder of Planned Parenthood. It says, the most merciful thing that the large family does to one of its infant members is to kill it. And so you start thinking, how can someone say that? And I don't know. I mean, I can't imagine any reason someone would say that. But if we want to start thinking about focus on the physical versus focus on the spiritual, maybe that somehow relates. And again, this is going to become more and more important, that we need to keep people focused on God, focused on eternity, focused on the spiritual, because with the genome degrading and that becoming more and more recognized, then if people just focus on the physical, that's going to be, it's going to have horrific consequences. The only reason I mention that is a part of her paper, and some people say that, well, she was just talking about how large families tend to be poor. And so in her, if someone's just focused on the physical, wow, there's nothing worse than being poor. I think every single one of us have known some of the, just extremely, extremely happy people that weren't really blessed financially, I guess, for a way to phrase it, but blessed in so many other ways. But anyway, that's an aside. She had a plan for peace. Purpose of the American Baby Code shall be to provide for better distribution of babies and to protect society against the propagation and increase of the unfit. Talked about women having a permit. No woman shall have the legal right to bear a child. No man shall have the right to become and so again, this focus on the pure focus on the physical. Now, the focus on the physical, people also really start to look at our physical differences. So now, from true science, as genetics have advanced, we know that the DNA of a single man and a single woman, you could have all of the physical characteristics of all the people we see on Earth today. There's even additional studies where, from the study of mitochondrial DNA, there's agreement that we all descended from a single woman. From a study of the Y chromosome, there's agreement that we could have all descended from a single man. Now that doesn't mean, atheists are saying, oh, Adam and Eve is true. They'll talk about, ages, like tens of thousands or over 100,000 years ago, ages that aren't biblical. But again, that's so again, true science is advanced. It shows there's no such thing as races. The Bible, talks, in Acts and in Genesis, again, very clear against this whole idea of races. But this was, these were some quotes. Now, this is Charles Darwin. Apologize, this is really racist quotes, but I think it's useful if you're talking to someone and they start saying things like, oh, well, I just believe Charles Darwin, or I'm putting my faith in Charles Darwin. You go anywhere in the world, you ask people if they've heard about Charles Darwin, and they'll say, oh, yeah, we've heard of Charles Darwin. So this is what he said. And this is in his book, The Descent of Man. It's really funny. I saw someone question on this once, and they said, oh, he never talked about race as an origin of the species. Okay? So you get the deceitfulness, the craftiness of men. You're right. It was in The Descent of Man that he talked about it. So again, it's it's just part of evangelizing, part of unmasking the science. Which is and this is completely fake science. Shouldn't even be considered science, but it had a huge influence and still has a huge influence around the world. So that some future period not very distant, as measured by centuries, a civilized race of man will most certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. At the same time, the anthropomorphous apes will no doubt be exterminated. The break between man and his nearest allies will then be wider, for it will intervene between man and a more civilized state, as we may hope, even than the Caucasian, and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of as now between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla. Okay, so if you think about what you just said, that's about the most racist statement you could imagine. But you also notice the fancy, I'll call them just fancy words, just to be, talks about, everything from, intervening and break between man and his nearest allies. And so again, you have to kind of cut through the nonsense and see, okay, what's this guy really saying? And he's basically saying that, he's a Caucasian. He thinks Caucasians are superior. And other races he basically is equating as close to being a gorilla or a baboon. And then he also spent about 2 or 3 pages setting up why, in his mind, men were superior to women. And so some of the culmination in those quotes says, the average mental power man must be above that of woman. He apparently, in his own mind, thought he had proven that scientifically. And then thus man has ultimately become superior to women in poetry, strength, voice, etc. And so this is Charles Darwin. And again, it wouldn't even be worth mentioning him except for, he's still taught. Can you imagine? I think the cancel culture maybe is fading. But how did he not get canceled? Because you can buy these books. Got a copy of these books too. You can buy them if you want to. But for whatever reason, I think it's just the power of, I'll just say the power of a false religion, the power of atheism in our society today. Ernst Haeckel, again, we talked about him with the Monera. I won't even bother reading these. Same thing. He basically followed Darwin, and he was comparing certain, basically just people of certain appearance, just their different cultures to dogs. Now, of course, he would call them races, and he would say they were less evolved than everything else. And so that was Ernst Haeckel. So you think, well, okay, Darwin and Haeckel, how much influence could they have had? Well, we go back to our famous biology textbook that was used within a few miles of here. This is taught as science in 1914, Hunter's of Civic Biology. Says, at present time there exist upon the earth 5 races or varieties of man, each very different from the other in instinct, social customs, and to extent and structure. These are the Ethiopian or Negro. He goes on, at the end he says, and finally, the highest type of all, the Caucasians. Okay, so this is science class. Again, fake science, 100% fake science. True science always confirms the Bible. From true science, we know there's no races. A lot of the evolutionists and the atheists caught up 20 or 30 years ago when they started saying we shouldn't use the term race. But it's 100% fake science. But we taught this as science, and so then you wonder, well, why was there a problem with racism? And there's probably not one answer, but the fact that someone could think back to their high school biology class and they were taught as fact, as scientific fact, that they were either in an inferior race or a superior race. That's going to have a huge impact on a child. It has a huge impact on adults. And so this was, again, taught in that was in Hunters of Civic Biology. Margaret Sanger, founder of Planned Parenthood, and again, they have been getting some pushback on this in recent years. But one of her quotes, we should hire 3 or 4 colored ministers, preferably with social service backgrounds and with engaging personalities. The most successful educational approach to the Negro is through a religious appeal. We don't want the word to go out that we want to exterminate the Negro population. And one of the, won't go too far. You can look and see like what neighborhoods they tended to advertise in and push things in, and that was all. That makes a fair amount of press now. But anyway, so that's a quote. But again, she probably grew up being taught certain things were science that were totally fake science. And so again, it's not making excuses, but it's just, you think about what things might have been like 100 years ago, but realize we could be in danger of going into a similar situation again today. And then of course, culminated kind of in the idea of a master race and exterminating people that, in Hitler's mind hadn't even evolved into being human yet. And you go back and look at what he was saying. And so he had, again, not sure what all motivated Adolf Hitler, but he was sure able to use this fake science as a way to justify what he was doing, at least to some people. Margaret Sanger, we should apply a stern and rigid policy of sterilization and segregation to that grade of population whose progeny is tainted or whose inherited is such that the objectionable traits may be transmitted to offspring. Adolf Hitler, if nature does not wish that weaker individuals should mate with the stronger, she wishes even less that a superior race should intermingle with an inferior one, because in such cases all her efforts throughout hundreds of thousands of years to establish an evolutionary higher stage of being may thus be rendered futile. So again, very similar quotes. And again, that was the time we were in, but just looking now at what we're doing, if we really are doing genetic testing, which we are, and determining who gets to live and who doesn't, it's very similar to what at least some countries in the world are doing today. What the Bible says about race is Acts 17:26, and he has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and boundaries of their dwellings. Genesis 1:27, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. And so I just finish up with a couple slides here. True science is a Christian's friend. When we say unmask the science, it's let's look at the true science. Let's not pretend that life just made itself. Let's not pretend that we can't make choices. Let's not pretend that somehow this bacteria turned itself into all of the different kinds of life we see around us. You unmask the science. In other words, science tells us, no, life couldn't make itself. No, a bacteria can't turn itself into a human being. I'll say we know that we have free will. People say, well, how can you test that for sure? Well, okay, just, that's something we know. And then, of course, the other questions that the Bible answers all the way back to just the fact that God created not just the heavens and the earth, but God also created time, shows God's outside of time, answers fundamental questions that we have about the existence of the universe as a whole. But again, fake science is often used to claim evil is good and good is evil. Isaiah 5:20-23, woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and prudent in their own sight. Woe to men mighty at drinking wine, woe to men valiant for mixing intoxicating drink, who justify the wicked for a bribe, take away justice from the righteous man. We'll have a few minutes. I want to just quickly cover two more topics. First one is vestigial organs. And this idea, this is this is going to go really how now some of the physical ways that atheism hurts us. It hurts spiritually, but this was one example. This was called vestigial organs and structures. Vestigial structure is structure that is remnant of an organism's evolutionary past and has no function, from the Latin. So that's out of a textbook. And what it basically was saying was that there were 180 organs and structures in our body that did absolutely nothing. Okay, and it was tried to be used as proof of evolution. Now, biblically, we know that the functionality of some organs and structures has degraded since Adam's sin, since you have natural selection, mutations. But there's no such thing as an evolutionary leftover. In other words, I don't have any organ or structure in my body that's only there because I used to be a pig and pigs needed that. It's just not. That's not a. We just don't see that. And again, vestigial structures evidence of scientific ignorance. I'll call it, not evolution. And so this was pro-evolution evidence, quote unquote, available at the 1925 Scopes trial, when of course the U.S. was deciding whether or not to teach that maybe apes turned into humans. So the punchline is that by 2003, important functions have been found for all 180 of those organs and structures once thought to be vestigial. The last holdout was the appendix, and it found out that the appendix is really important in the development of our immune system. Most of the bacteria in our digestive system is actually good for us. There's actually, this, kind of the gross statistic for the night, but apparently there's many, many times more bacterial cells in our bodies than there are human cells. Okay, and that's just because bacteria are so small, but they're very important. So we don't want our appendix attacking those, or we don't want our immune system attacking those. And so it's again, a lot of functions have been found for the appendix. And so that was about 2003. There were dozens of papers kind of simultaneously released about all the. Now, when we get to be older, we can have our appendix removed. It's not necessarily good for us, but its main function is when we're young, but it's an extremely important function. And so, but the question is, well, why did it take from 1895 to 2003 to figure out these functions? I mean, it seems like we could have studied them harder. Well, when you think about it, if you were just a brilliant young anatomist in 1895, I think that's when Wiedersheim produced or made those claims, would you have bothered studying a vestigial organ or structure? Yeah, of course not. I mean, you think, why would I waste my career studying this evolutionary leftover? I want to study something that's important, something that the people still need. And so, the length of time, that would be just this idea that it was a false argument. Again, just ignorance. Didn't know what the organ did, so that must be proof for evolution. So that ignorance really held back true science. Now, what's ironic is there was also an attempt to do that with DNA. When we first had mapped the genome, we noticed that it was a very small percentage of the DNA actually coded for proteins. And so for whatever reason, some people started saying, well, the rest of that DNA must be junk. But again, that was not too many people fell for that one. I think more people fell for the vestigial organs. Not too many people fell for the junk DNA. But if some of you are old enough, you remember for a few years, it was, most of our DNA is just junk. Well, it was just being pushed. It wasn't scientific. It was just being pushed by evolutionists. The point being is the analogy, probably the closest analogy, it'd be just like saying if you were going to fix a transmission and you got a manual for that transmission, the first few pages are going to be the parts list, and then the rest of the manual is going to be how to put it together. And it'd be just like saying, well, the parts list is all that matters, and how to put it together, that's just junk. Okay, so again, not a lot of people, but it did, it still had some impact. Belief in vestigial structure slowed scientific progress, and again, data and true science are the Christian's friend. This is a quote, I'll just mention this, because this book is still out there. This was Dawkins wrote it, Greatest Show on Earth. 2009, what pseudogenes are useful for is embarrassing creationists. It stretches even their creative ingenuity to make up a reason why an intelligent denier should have created a pseudogene, unless he was deliberately setting out to fill it. Well, the point was there's no such thing as pseudogenes. That was based on the junk DNA. So you're right, if God had purposely created junk DNA that did absolutely nothing, yeah, that would be kind of strange. But what it really was, it's just scientific ignorance again. But you will still find people that still read this book, or they read this book, or they're being influenced by it. And so again, it's ignorance is the atheist's friend, true science is the Christian's friend. And this is just really piling on. This was actually from the Huntsville Times, because one of the, we have a Hudson Alpha, it's an excellent institute down in Huntsville, Alabama. They were part of a project. Again, this was in, I think it was 2012, 32 laboratories around the world, including Huntsville's Hudson Alpha Institute of Biotechnology, announced the simultaneous publication of 30 scientific papers detailing new discoveries in the ongoing ENCODE project. Instead of believing that only 2% of the genome is controlling cells, the ENCODE project has now proved that at least 80% of DNA has some function in cellular creation and growth. And then they went on and said most of them just knew that it was going to be 100%. It's just we hadn't figured it out yet. And so that was literally from 2009 when that book was published, and then 3 years later it was totally refuted. So, homologous structures, and this will be the last topic tonight, just because you hear about this some. You think about it, if I took an x-ray of my arm, and then you took the x-ray of a dog's leg, or you looked at the muscle tissue, or even the DNA to code for the muscle tissue, or the DNA to code for the bones, you see a lot of similarities. Okay, and so the idea is, okay, we have physical similarities amongst life forms, so do those physical similarities somehow indicate or prove that one kind of life turned into another, in other words, in that example would be like dogs turn into people, but in other words, the similarities in DNA sequences or bones or muscles or tissues, does that somehow prove that one form of life turned into another? Now, if you go out on the internet, again, if it's dominated by people, pushing atheism or pushing evolution, you'll come across statements like this. This top one says, this observation makes little sense for created objects since a creator could mix and match features observed in any organism. That's from the Department of Zoology at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. Okay, this observation makes little sense for created objects since a creator could mix and match features observed in any organism. Scientific or religious statement? That's 100% religious, I mean, they don't even, to me, that doesn't even, they don't even try to pretend that it's scientific other than it's a science department, because it's just saying that, that's their view of God. That's their view. And then, of course, you have, go through the standard textbooks, homologous structures are similar because they're modified versions of structures that occurred in a common ancestor, similarities, early development forms. Now, it turns out in the development of an embryo, we start, again, looking into the true science. Do you ever do those real irritating puzzles where they say, okay, draw this pattern without lifting your pencil from the paper and not crossing a line? And well, when you think about it, turning a single fertilized egg into like a person, or any animal for that matter, how do you do that? How do you? And so it turns out that there's certain processes along the way that you just say it's really ingenious engineering to be able to turn, again, a single fertilized egg, because we got arms and legs and organs and structures and everything else all coming from a single fertilized egg. So the quote reads, as with yolk sac, gill slit formation represents an ingenious and adaptable solution to a difficult engineering problem. And it goes on and just talks about, but it says following DNA instructions in their respective egg cells, fish and human beings each used a similar process to develop their distinctive features. So it's basically how do you get organs, how do you get structures? So advanced in true science, we realize that no, just because maybe, and a lot of those drawings were fraudulent, but even if there are some similarities during the development of various kinds of animals, it's all engineering. The DNA was always there, that a fish is always going to be a fish, a rabbit's always going to be a rabbit, a person's always going to be a person. So true science is advancing. But then the other thing that we can look at from our personal experience is, when we see similarities, what does that usually indicate? Like if we see a similar, if we're driving down the road, we turn on the radio, we hear a song, a lot of times we'll know, first time we hear the song, we'll still say, hey, I bet you such and such wrote that. Well, the reason we know that is it had the same creator. In other words, we hear the similarities in the song. When we hear similarities, same musical style, same voice, same topic sometimes, then we can start to piece that together, saying, okay, that's got a lot of similarities to this other song that was written by this person, so I bet you this person wrote it. Or if we see a painting, and a lot of us, if we had, I have always been horrible at art, and I'm pretty sure it's hopeless. But but the whole point is, there's people out there that they can tell just from looking at a painting, who painted the painting. And again, it's from the similarities. When we see similarities, we recognize the same creator. So our experience would be when we see physical similarities, that's because God created all life. But the physical similarities aren't what's important. It's the spiritual difference. Because we go back to Genesis 1:27, only people are created in God's image. And so we are completely different from animals in the way that matters. Only people are created in God's image, God's spiritual image. So that is the important difference. But the physical similarities, that's exactly what we'd expect, given that God created all life. And so, but someone could also say, no, I think the physical similarities are because fish turned into this. Okay, so it's not a scientific debate, but it's also not too important because, it's not scientific, but it's also, again, we need to emphasize the spiritual difference between people and animals, and that's, again, because only people are created in God's image. So, true science is the Christian's friend. Romans 1:20-22, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools. And again, it's just kind of speaks for itself. There's going to be people that the more science advances, the more we are without excuse. You can almost, you go back hundreds of years, and you can almost think, well, they knew nothing about, so maybe make excuses for them. We have no excuse now, just because of the level to which God has allowed our science to advance. So true science is a Christian's friend. And again, bringing it all back around, the main point, get someone to objectively consider the Bible, get them to study the Bible. Romans 1:16, for I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first and also for the Greek. And again, the Bible gives us many, many ways we can study with a person. I'll go back to when we were in Honduras. We were just using examples out of the book of Acts, and that really I had one person saying that they had they were just too bad. God could never save them. And so we went back to Acts 2:36 through 47. And these were the people that had crucified Jesus. And then you ask it in different ways, but very gently, okay, have you done anything worse than that? And of course he's like, sin is sin. So that's why you have to be careful. I'm not saying that, some sins are less than other sins, but of course immediately the person's like, well, no, I haven't, for whatever reason. And then you say, okay, well, what were they told to do? Well, they were told to repent and be baptized. And so we talked about that. Another person get to be saved, and then another person we talked to about she hadn't been baptized yet. She knew she needed to be baptized. From the Bible, other examples, she knew, essentially, she'd heard, she believed Jesus was the Son of God. She wanted to repent. She was obviously willing to confess Jesus, Son of God, and then she knew that she needed to be baptized. But for whatever reason, she was saying, maybe delay, maybe study some more. So we talked about the Philippian jailer. I talked about as soon as they'd studied, and he knew that he was baptized that very night. So that's over in Acts 16. So again, it's but that's kind of the bottom line, is get people objectively considering the Bible, get them to study the Bible with them, show them what God is, a free gift. Salvation is a free gift from God, but show them this is, to accept that free gift. The Bible is very clear what we should do. And so always would say that I know this is they always talk about the Wednesday night crowd. Well, the Friday night crowd's even more dedicated. So, I'm imagine everyone here has obeyed the gospel, but I don't know that. And a lot of you people I don't know. And really appreciate your attention. But if you have any questions at all, just what the Bible says we're to do to receive the free gift of salvation, please just talk to any of the elders here or anybody here. But that's anyway, that was all I had prepared for tonight. My clock here says 8:30, so I guess that was okay. But any quick questions or comments, or long questions or comments? I love doing this. So. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Did you want to be first?
No.
Okay.
You got
Good.
a lineup.
I wanted to ask what you thought about a question about evolution versus creation.
Okay.
And you're talking about Darwin tonight quite a bit. And I see a lot of people, a large group of people, trying to rescue different species that are dwindling towards extinction. And they go to great means to try and save them, spend a lot of money. They get the government money through the institutions and the universities and stuff. And I think they're crazy. And the same group of people believe in evolution. They want to save them, everything, but they believe in evolution. So why can't they just let it evolve?
Yeah, you're right. That's
To me, it's a great conflict.
yeah.
Am I wrong? Or
Yeah.
do you see this conflict?
No, it's an inconsistency, and I think so. Rush Limbaugh said this, and of course he would say he's entertaining and stuff. So I'm not sure if he was. I know a lot of what he'd say would be tongue in cheek, but I think he made the point you're making. He said, "Why would we care if the polar bears go extinct? Because they'll just evolve again in 1,000,000 years." And and so if someone's an evolutionist, they would, that's, but again, if you look at, there's original created kinds, and you have natural selection and mutation since Adam sinned acting on the original created kinds, and that's how you end up with things like polar bears. You're losing information from the genome, so just from true science, we know, no, once the species is extinct, it's extinct. So you're right, it's an inconsistency. They'll go off and say, well, we believe in evolution, but then, which is, again, goes against everything we know about science, but then they'll turn back around and say, rightfully, because I agree with them completely, once a species is extinct, it's extinct, and especially if it's like a whole kind of animal going extinct. And so they'll want to try to do what we can, we're supposed to be good stewards of creation, do what we can to keep a species from going extinct, but that really is inconsistent with evolution. And some people will push it a step further. They say, no, if it's a weaker species, we should let it go extinct, because if we keep it alive, that's going to hurt evolution. Because it's survival of the fittest, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So no, I agree completely with what you said. Yeah.
It's more and more conflicted to me.
Yeah. Just it's a huge inconsistency.
Thank you.
No, thank you. Thanks.
Love the concept of the fact that we have the right to choose, the ability to choose, helps us know whom we should choose and how we should choose, since we're not just mere chemical reactions. I can see myself having this discussion with friends and them countering, well, animals make choices. They use tools. They pick which, the prey picks which, or not the hunter chooses
Right.
which prey to seek out. What are some ways to respond to that?
Okay, so and that's a huge how to phrase it. So a lot of opinions on that one, I guess you'd say. But what I would say, first of all, make it clear that we are different than animals because only people are created in God's image, and then also just I'd never underestimate the underestimate the capabilities of life that God has made. And so they're different than people are, but either it's if it still comes down to, if they were just chemicals, they aren't really making choices. And so I guess I'd say the two biggest opinions are one is it's just they're think of their DNA as very sophisticated artificial intelligence. So they learn really fast. They learn which animals they're more likely to catch. They watch other animals. They know, like if it's the hunter hunting a prey. And so it's just a very, it's all pre-programmed, it's all chemical, but it's really sophisticated. So that's one view. The other view is that somehow they are actually making choices, even though we know they're different than people, because only people have, we're creating God's image, we have a soul. And so, it would still be true if the animal is truly making a choice. It can't just be chemical. But it's also, and that's just kind of what we've learned about DNA. I mean, it's fascinating what they talk about DNA now. It's not, again, we used to think, oh wow, 6 billion nucleotides, and how many letters in an encyclopedia. Let me start figuring out, well, wait, you can read it forwards, you can read it backwards, you can skip letters. Depending on how the DNA folds up, you can read across the DNA. And so it's more sophisticated than anything we can imagine. And so with that, it's just a question of, it's those two options. Is it just chemical, or is it just purely chemical, or is there some way? If it's just purely chemicals, then the animal can't be making a choice. And so that's the argument. Sometimes people will say, we're just the same way. But I think we know we make choices. And so that's the key. Because I can't imagine that was because of the lights and great audience and everything. I just decided to lift the remote. But and boy, you can get. Well, I'll just say that's one to try to, if you're talking to someone you want to, setting up a Bible study, that can be a minefield, because there are going to be people that they are 100% convinced that their dog just has a human being trapped inside of it, and don't try to argue with that. I mean, just go back to, again, only people are created in God's image. So, thank you though. Thanks, excellent question. Okay. All right. That's my cue. So, right. Oh, sorry. Okay.
Well, thank you very much.
Oh, no, thank you.
I'll close this with a prayer, and then also I've got a couple other comments to make right after, and thank you so much.
Thank you. And tomorrow night we'll talk about assumptions in the age of the universe and assumptions in the age of the earth. But thank you from my standpoint for being here tonight too. Appreciate that.
Thank you. Let's bow for a moment of prayer. Dear God in heaven, we thank you so much that we were able to be here in person or online. We thank you for this doctor that was able to present the Unmasking the Science topic tonight. Wow, what a topic. What a man this man is. We thank you that you are using him in a powerful way. And Father, at this time, we pray that you will use us in a powerful way too, to take much of this information and help others to see you. That we need to really unmask that fake science that so many people hang on. And we need to expose it for what it is. It's fake science. So, Father, help us to do that. Help us to recall many of the points that Dr. Houts has made tonight. We pray your blessings be upon us as we talk to others. We pray your blessings be upon Dr. Houts as he continues to talk about these things around this country, and that he will be able to reach many, many people that want to please you but are misguided, and that his technology and his wisdom will be able to help them out. So, Father, we pray that you'll use us as those tools to reach these people. Father, we thank you for this seminar. We thank you for Dr. Houts and his family, and we pray your continued blessings on him and his family and us, that we all may do your will. And these things we pray in Jesus' name, amen. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I do want to remind you that we will be back here tomorrow night, as Dr. Houts has mentioned. Tomorrow's topic at 7 o'clock will be assumptions and the age of the earth. That definitely will be another very interesting topic. Also on Sunday morning at 10 o'clock, the topic Dr. Houts will present is Evolution is Religion. And at 11 o'clock, the topic will be From Athens to Christ. So we hope that you will be able to come back and join us. And also, too, if you would like to stay even tonight, there will be coffee and donuts down at the fellowship hall. And at that time, if you have any other questions or want to make some comments to Dr. Houts, you can do that at that time. So thank you. And also, too, remember, even for the folks here in person, that these topics and presentations are being recorded. And so you will be able to go back, as I plan to do, and watch them a few times and really be able to grasp even more of that information that he presented, and we'll be able to use it. So with this, I would like to end this presentation with a song, and I'll invite Ken Shepard up to do that. Thank you.
I get to talk too. How many of you remember the old television sitcom MASH about the Korean War? Radar O'Reilly in several of the episodes had a voiceover, and basically he was writing to his mother. And I remember one episode where it started out, "Dear Mom, I'm writing this slow because I know you can't read very fast." And that's what I felt like listening to Dr. Houts. So much good information, so encouraging, and so useful. Especially now in society where we're not trying to convince people that, the Church of Christ versus Baptist or Lutheran is right. We're trying to convince people there's a God, because they say, no, there isn't. We've got to back way up, and this information is fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Houts. Let's stand together. We'll sing 2 verses of How Great Thou Art, singing about our great God.
O Lord my God, when I in awesome wonder consider all the worlds thy hands have made, I see the stars, I hear the rolling thunder, thy power throughout the universe displayed. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou
tomorrow.